So, I'm going to see with you what it means to affirm the collective right for workers to validate or veto a firm's decisions, which is the key philosophical principle of the democratizing principle of the manifesto. The Democratizing Work manifesto lays out the philosophical principle that should apply to the way we organize work. Indeed, we write a personal investment of labor, that is of one's mind and body, of one's health, of one's very life, ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto a firm's decisions. What does that mean? Well, when we speak about a personal investment of labor, we mean to highlight a reality that capitalism has always sought to render invisible. Clearly, workers are not resources in a production process, nor commodities to be exchanged on a market. They actually are the key labor investors without whom there would be no production, no services, no business at all. They are the true investors. They invest their body, their mind, themselves entirely, contrary to the so-called investors who actually only inject money, which is something external to themselves. Indeed, the risk taken by capital investors is extremely limited, hence the term limited liability. What workers are demonstrating day and night is that they are not one type of stakeholders among others. They are the core constituency and actually the only one who is governed by the rules and decisions of the firm. So despite being the firm's core constituency, if you look at corporate law, well, they are mostly excluded from participating in the government of their workplaces, of what is descriptively their firm. Actually, they form the firm, even though the corporation does not want to recognize that fact, as it's typically the case with the platform firms. Governing the firm, indeed, is the right that is monopolized by capital investors. What we have seen in the 20th century, typically after the First or the Second World War, depending on countries, is that the undeniable contribution made during the war by women helped them get the legitimacy to get the right to vote. It became unavoidable to recognize their essential contribution, and they eventually got recognized as equal citizens. By the same token today, this is what we say in the manifesto, after having professed wonderful praise, words of recognition, deemed them essential, it is high time that we recognize workers as citizens in the workplace, in a word, that we enfranchise them. So how do we go after that? How can workers become citizens in the firm? Well, obviously, if the firm is a worker cooperative governed democratically according to the norm one worker, one vote, then workers constitute indeed the demos of the firm, standing as equals and truly exercising their right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm. But this concerns only a teeny fraction of the 10% of the global population which work in the cooperative sector. Because even in the cooperative sector, many cooperatives are producers or consumers cooperatives and not workers cooperatives, which make only a fraction of that 10%. So how are we getting there? How are we moving the entire capitalist economy into the democratic structure? Well, now, if you consider that workers are the constituency that is still kept out of the government of firms, while it should benefit from at least the same rights as those enjoyed by capital investors, then you get to the principle actually embodied in the history of collective bargaining, the right to collectively validate or veto decisions. Democratizing Work injects the principle of collective bargaining right into the very heart of companies in order for labor investors to have a collective voice over the ends and the means of the shared endeavor, which is the firm. All these questions concern workers, and they should get the right to collectively validate or veto the responses to these questions. So, like, for instance, what services are we going to provide? What kind of products are we going to develop? Who should benefit from them? With what means? How can efforts be fairly distributed? Who should be chosen to become the next CEO? How should profits be divided? As we wrote in the manifesto, a personal investment of labor ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto these decisions. When researching the history of political revolutions and how political entities moved from the despotism of one constituency, in our case, when you think about the corporate capitalist firm, shareholders, to move from the despotism of that constituency into their own democratization, I realized that we can see there appearing the same philosophical principle that is at the core of collective bargaining, this right to collectively validate or veto decisions. This is why I call this principle, as applied to the firm, economic bicameralism at the firm level. So how do we put this principle into practice? Organizationally speaking, we can roughly go two ways. First avenue, well, a full second chamber should be established next to the board of the corporation. As it already exists in some continental European systems, you find works councils at the firm level. These councils are crowded by workers' representatives elected on unions list. And here you have what is actually the second chamber, but just that today it is concerned with information and consultation, but not actual decision-making rights. That second chamber could be easily elevated to the same level of the board and could be granted the right to collectively validate or veto the decisions that come to the board. A second avenue for countries where those works councils do not exist, we can imagine that the board of directors or the supervisory board would be expanded to include representatives of labor investors, requiring majority votes from that group. And we can call this a dual majority board. This would be a much stronger situation for workers collectively than the current co-determination Mitbestimmung arrangements that are very well known to have been established in Germany after World War II. This collective veto power exercised by labor investors at the level of corporate governance is the institutional translation of what in labor history has sometimes been called worker control. It is a transitional proposal that can serve as a bridge toward the complete democratization of firms via labor investors buying back at some point the shares of their firm held by capital investors. The day labor investors have the knowledge about how to govern the firm, they can indeed buy back those shares and do not need a capital investors' chamber of representatives anymore. Then their firms will become truly democratic firms. Democratizing work has a long way to go, but the avenue is real and possible. If we want firms to meet and respect planetary boundaries, we ought to find the necessary mechanisms to put an end to the extractive dynamic of capital interests. And it's reasonable to say that transforming internally the government of firms by democratizing work can play a key part in this. If you want to read more about this, there are many references that I'm going to paste here, and I look forward more discussion, in particular in the context of the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.